So, hello everyone. It is my pleasure to open this closing session. So this is sort of the beginning of the end. My name is Daniel Wagner. I'm a researcher at DKIX, and I'm going to present you I would say, the most recent research work that we did at RIXP. Joint work together with colleagues from Georgia Tech, TU Delft, and Merit Networks. It's titled How to Operate a Telescope Without Operating a Telescope. Sounds a bit weird, but it's actually doable, and I will show you how. So first start off with what actually is an internet telescope. Well, basically, it is a chunk of IP address space that is announced to the public internet via BGP, so it's reachable to the public internet. And then what's special about it is that you do not do anything with that. So you announce your IP address space and you don't host any services in it, so we consider it to be dark. And if you do that, you would not expect to see any packets, right? So nobody should contact you because you're not hosting anything, so there's no purpose in contacting your network. But actually, packets do come in. And this kind of traffic we refer to as the internet background radiation. So this could be caused, but this has 3 different causes that I'm going to dive into. But for example, there could be scans on the internet, so people looking for services or looking for hosts, maybe some abandoned systems that do operate exploitable protocols, but some malicious people could use for their actions. So for example, we've got the scanner here. So this is this weirdo guy down there, and he's just scanning the whole /0, so basically every address on the internet, and on the IPv4 address space, to be exact in this study. And so they will eventually contact your telescope network. What you do with the telescope network basically is you run TCP dump behind that, and you just capture anything that's coming in. This is an analogy, so the reason why we call this a telescope. The analogy is that if you have a real telescope, those things that you can use to look into the sky, if you point them to a dark space in the sky where there are no stars, you would not expect to see anything, but still you see the cosmic background radiation. So this is why we call those kind of networks the internet telescopes. So what can we do with that? So why is this actually a thing? Well, this has some security use cases. So network internet security does need to know, you want to have some kind of intelligence about who is scanning, so what networks are operating such scans. To the side, this is sometimes an educational network, some students performing some tests, but could also be malicious people. What ports are being scanned? So by ports, I mean the transport protocol port. So that is somebody looking for, let's say, a telnet port, port 23. We'll see those kind of very prominent ports later on. How many scanners are there? Yeah, and who are they actually? So where are they? What network and what kind of entity is behind that? Could be behind this. The thing why this is interesting is that usually malicious people do spoof their source addresses to carry out attacks, but when a malicious actor needs to know where the vulnerable systems are, they need to get the response, so they rather not spoof their source address because they just need the response back. All of this helps to gain insights and will lead to insights into attack vectors, so what is currently being prominently used on the web, so what new services are coming up that, for example, can be used for launching DDoS attacks. And in the end, if you have this kind of knowledge, you could prevent such attacks. All right, so now the kind of idea that we had, this overall scheme, is, there are these 3 sources, namely the misconfigurations, could be misconfigurations like, for example, DNS services misconfigured, they are pointing to a wrong IP address, which happens to be in your telescope, so you will get some resolvers trying to contact you, just as an example. You've got all kinds of scanners out there, and you have attack backscatter, which is the 3rd thing, but I won't go into detail on this. So the idea here is that we, as an IXP operator, if we leverage our vantage point in the internet, which is somewhere there, we will see those kind of scanning activity going through the internet to basically all networks on the internet. So these kind of networks could be the ones that are actually operational telescopes, and we collaborated with them. You'll see after. And this is the rest of the internet also. And what this figure does not show too nicely is that it also terminates inside inside the internet backbone. So since we see the traffic that is going towards the telescopes and to all the other networks, we could derive certain characteristics from what the telescopes as a ground truth source do see and then infer where there are more of those networks that do see the exact same kind of traffic patterns. Is it moving? Gotta push it hard. All right. So as said, we were collaborating with 3 operational telescopes, and we were using or basically inferring the kind of traffic characteristics that telescopes usually do see. And with this, we developed a methodology that can be applied to any network in the forwarding backbone of the internet. In our case, it was IXPs, but could also be ISPs, to derive more address based on the internet that is not a telescope or not necessarily. And those prefixes or in subnets that we could infer scanning traffic for, we refer to as meta-telescope prefixes. And then with that, we try to find as many of these meta-telescope prefixes as possible, which in the end gives us a huge set of prefixes for which we know they receive scanning activity. And this effectively gives us a very large telescope without operating a telescope. Traditionally or typically, if you operate a telescope, you have 1 prefix. The bigger the prefix is, the more scanning traffic you will see, the more insights you might get. But still, 1 prefix is located in, well, hang on, first thing is if a scanner knows about your telescope prefix, they can just blocklist this prefix so that they will no longer scan it, meaning that the attacker knows or the malicious actor knows that telescope can no longer infer what I am scanning. So I basically make them blind towards what I'm interested in, and they can't get back the knowledge to prevent my attacks. So once your prefix is being blocklisted, your telescope is pretty much useless. So this is also why those prefixes are being kept secret. So if you have 1 prefix, it belongs to 1 AS. And sometimes scanners are interested in scanning data center networks rather than educational networks, for example. If your telescope is located in an educational network, for most universities that we collaborated with, this is true, they do not see the kind of scanning activity that's going towards data centers. So now as we have got lots and lots of these meta-telescope prefixes, well, they are in basically every type of network. And lastly, some networks that are located in a specific country are being scanned more than others or differently than others. Meaning that if you have 1 telescope that is, say, in the Netherlands, you will see likely Netherlands scanning traffic, but not the scanning traffic of, let's say, China. Once again, in our case, we can infer scanning traffic that goes to Chinese networks. So, well, you'll see the map afterwards, the whole world, meaning that we have no such constraints. And this is why this is actually a cool thing in the academia. All right, so first of all, we need to get the characteristics from the traffic. So we were collaborating, as I said, with 3 telescopes. 2 of them are in Europe in different countries. We refer to them as TEU1 and TEU2. And there is another one in the US. Those telescopes, as said, operate TCP dumps, so we get the full packet captures. That gives us lots of insights. Yeah, but those 3 telescopes have different prefix sizes, so they're quite mixed. It was also interesting, gave us some insights. And we were looking at a 24-hour period somewhere this April. First of all, when we're investigating those PCAPs, we found the obvious one, right? So telescope does not host anything, so it's not sending anything, so we don't have any outbound traffic here. But what's coming in is more interesting. And this is where we start with. First of all, we find that most of the traffic, namely, depending on the telescope, it was about 90% of any incoming packet to be an empty TCP SYN. So these are scanners that are trying to establish a connection on a certain port, trying to figure out what service could be running behind this port, behind this IP address. And those packets consist of a 20 bytes IP header and a 20 bytes TCP header. But some of them have an option set, which spends another 8 bytes to the packet size. Those options can be used for fast reopening and other things that attackers might be looking for. So this is why we did, because we didn't exactly know what packet size we should now use for our inference. And this is why we did a sensitivity analysis on the packet size. The details are in the paper. And it turns out that the average is exactly in the middle, between 40 and 48 bytes. So it's 44 bytes what we use for our threshold. Coincidence? I don't know. Next thing is that we were looking at the amount of packets that a telescope receives. Well, this depends on the size. As said, the larger telescope prefix is, the more packets you will be recording. Per /24 and per day, we found that this is 1.7 million packets on average, well, given our 3 telescopes that we work with. And lastly, well, that's it. Okay, there's more coming after. All right, so now we have those characteristics of scanning traffic, and we do now apply this to our IXP data set. We have 14 IXPs in our study. They are spread across Europe, North America, and one is in Asia, diverse mem accounts, diverse peak traffic volumes. We were looking, and we were having a sampled flow data data set of the same time. So it's once again the 24 hours somewhere this April. So here's a pipeline that we basically had. So on the left, you will see those characteristics. Once again, we added a few filters more to narrow down this flow data to actually find the meta-telescope prefixes. We first of all were looking at TCP only. Unfortunately, we could not check for the TCP flags, which would help us to just find the TCP SYNs, but we knew that 90% of all is TCP SYN, so that was okay to neglect. Then we have got our magic byte threshold. We're not looking for any outbound traffic. And we were further filtering out reserved IP address spaces or private IP address space because they can't be a telescope, right? We also require the telescope to be globally routed. As said, you have to announce your prefix. If it's not announced, it can't be a telescope. And lastly, we're applying our packet count threshold. So if you look to the right, I've got this figure here. So we started off with some 6 million/24 subnets in the IXP dataset. And by successively applying the filters, we were down to about 370,000 meta-telescope prefixes. We found some 800 something K more /24 nets that violated any of those filters. And if they violated the no outbound filter, well, then it's a gray net. Yeah? Gray net means that some portions of the network appear to be active, another part of the /24 appears to be dark, so we say it's a gray net. However, we were looking for those /24s, the real dark nets. So these are the dark nets for which every data point we had qualified as exactly scanning traffic, right? So mind those 380K that we just saw, because it's now down to 318K. And this is because so far we have just been seeing what we are measuring, but we can't really tell whether we're just measuring scanning traffic or whether the prefix that we're looking at is actually inactive. So we were using external data sources, namely Census, NDT, and ISI, to further eliminate networks that those external data sources told us that these blocks are actually being active. So we considered those ones we had before to contain false positives. And this is the one we can say that the external data sources confirmed that we are actually on the right track. So this table shows us the stats for all the individual sites. As said, we've got 14 IXPs. And if we combine all of them, we can find that there are fewer meta-telescope prefixes surviving our filtering compared to if I looked at certain sites individually. This means that the more knowledge of different IXPs we combine, the more precise we can get. And actually, the false positive rates here is higher than here. This is the lowest false positive rate we could have, about 11 point something%. Details are in the paper. Further, we find that the largest IXP, which is CE1, finds meta-telescope prefixes in over 200 countries. This is awesome. You know, this is like equivalent you would need to get 200 different prefixes in 200 different countries as a researcher, for example, or enthusiast or whoever. This is basically undoable. And then we found that the second largest one finds meta-telescope prefixes in the most different ASs, which is over 8,000. It's about 9,000, almost. All right, so far we have scanning traffic inferred. All right, cool. So, but is this actually correct? And to somehow get an idea of how precise our work has been so far, we were looking at the address space of a telescope that we collaborated with. So this is ground truth. And we're figuring out how many of those blocks we could identify are actually located inside the prefix that we know is a telescope. And this is how it looks like. This is a Hilbert curve. So Hilbert curve showing colorized blocks for the ones we inferred. These are /24 subnets. The white ones we don't have any data point for, or they are active or disqualified, so we couldn't make a claim, or we claim that it's not a telescope block. And we find that the ones we inferred are clearly inside the boundary. And while I was browsing through this Hilbert curve, like I had the whole IP version 4 address space. I will show you more insights of this on the next slide. you could clearly see those kind of patterns. So like this looks like a big fog, which is telling me, Daniel, look at this. There's a block or a larger region that contains only inactive addresses. And then I mapped the boundaries of our telescope on top, and I thought like, okay, looks good. And there are some blocks inferred to be dark, namely 5, outside the boundaries, which is okay because not all blocks on the internet need to be dark, right? Need to be active, sorry. So they are dark actually, or could be dark. So as said, we have got 2 more blocks that were quite catching my eyes. For example, we have another known telescope, which is pretty huge, but we didn't collaborate with. And I'll tell you that these 3 big blocks are the boundaries of the telescope. So I could have also drawn this that way. So, and then there appears to be another block, but we don't know what's going on there. And then we found a very large chunk of unused IP address space somewhere in the internet. So those kinds of patterns, they're like really popping my eyes. Well, all right, so let's see where they actually are located. So we used Maxmind GeoLight 2 to map those prefixes to country codes. And then with this, we generated this kind of a heat map, world map, I'd say. So the findings here from our data set is that most of these meta telescope prefixes are located in the US. Then to our data set, the second most populated meta telescope prefix country, I would say, appears to be China. This could be because we do not really see the traffic for Chinese networks, but it could also be that they are not active to the outside, or they are just unused. So different reasons here, possible causes. We also find that Africa tends to have the fewest meta telescope prefixes. So this could also be due to limitation of our visibility of the traffic, so we could not tell anything. Or this could also be that they just have to use what IP addresses they have. So next up, we were comparing those ports. Like this is the applications that are being scanned for. On the left, in the left table, you can see what we got from the PCAPs, from the ground truth, from our telescopes we collaborated with. And on the right, you've got the table for what we inferred with our methodology. Overall, we find that, as said, the port 23 telnet, SSH, port 22, and certain web services, 80 and 8080, are being most prominently scanned. So in green, I underlined what is the overlap. So we find that we are okay, decently somewhere close to what the ground truth is saying. And what is more interesting is that one of the telescopes that we collaborated with was configured on the Ingress router to drop any incoming packets on port 23, which is telnet, and port 445 for security reasons. Well, we don't have such filters. We do just observe what the internet's telling us, and we find those ports, namely port 23, to be apparently in our data set, the most prominent port. So we could now go ahead, call TEU1, hey guys, I know that you're going to be scanned on port 23 very heavily, and they say, nice. All right, let's move on. Then we did the same kind of analysis for network types. So we were looking at what network types are being scanned in what fashion on what ports most prominently. So first off, ISP networks, they pretty much dominated where we found the meta telescope prefixes to be located in. But still, we could find some things like data center networks are being scanned at port 80 or 8080 more than other ports inside the data center network, and also compared to other networks. This is quite not at scale. For scaling details, I refer to the paper, but the takeaway is still visible here. This is something you could not have if you just had one prefix located in a single network. And then once again, for a country or continent, we found, for example, which I just want to highlight here quickly, is that in Africa, for the day that we were scanning or analyzing, we found that in Africa, apparently there was a campaign going on port 37215. I have no clue what the service is behind that port. Once again, such insights are not possible if you just have your prefix in the Netherlands or in Germany or wherever. All right, so I should be summing up. In conclusion, we found that there are lots of /24 blocks inferable as so-called meta telescope prefixes around the globe in all network types. And as I said, the inference that we presented is basically applicable to any kind of network that is somewhere in the background and in the backbone of the network. the internet, that is carrying IBR, internet background radiation. And with all of those insights, and whoever is interested in leveraging some of these, this helps to improve internet security research overall.